Bienvenidos, Ushamdid, and welcome Anne Arundel Community College learners from the Spring 2023 semester taking the CTS-233 Section 400 Network Programmability course. This is the Cisco Networking Academy's DEVASC 200-901 Certification Exam Preparation course, and in this lab, 6.2.7, we're going to be doing a quick supplemental video here on the Flask Web Application Framework. Now, a lot of questions come up when we reach part 3 of this lab around what exactly the code that you see in the lab is doing. So we're going to take a look at that code, but I'm also going to do a little bit deeper dive into Flask, and we're going to see some examples of what Flask can do, ultimately leading up to us creating our own API server to which we can make an API GET request. So what is Flask? Well, Flask is for development. Bottom line, it is not to be used in production. You'll see that when we fire it up from the CLI on our DEVASC virtual machine. Now, you don't have to have the DEVASC virtual machine to do any of the things you're going to see me do in this lab, so you can follow along on your host machine or on a virtual machine that you might have. Now, you need to have Flask installed, and that is just pip3 install Flask. So this lab, or this video, is assuming that you've got Flask installed if you want to run some of the code that you see here. And so basically, it's a Python. Flask is a Python web framework. It allows you to build web apps super fast, right? And you're going to see just how quickly we can do that. Now, a lot of the learners will ask me, what's the difference between Flask and Apache or IIS? You know, these larger sort of web server suites. And I want you to think of Flask like this. Flask is like a bed and breakfast owned by a mom and pop, right? It's a little boutique, it's tiny, and that's what Flask is. Now, Apache and IIS, you could look at those as like the Marriott hotel chains or the Hilton hotel chains, these huge behemoth chains that are out there that have a big brand, right? And so Flask is just a tiny little lightweight web server. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at the code that we need in order to get Flask up and running, and then what we would do once it is up and running. Now, we're going to start with a simple Flask file here, or Python file that has Flask in it. Then we're going to transition to the sample_app, which is what you see in part 3 of lab 627. And then we're going to take a look at app 2, app 3, and then we're going to get into the API server, API client example that I gave you earlier. So how do we create a Python file and run a Flask web server in it? Well, we simply say from Flask, import Flask, and then we're going to create a Flask object right here, and we're going to call it app, right? And again, that's just a variable name, app. Now, what causes a lot of confusion is what you see right here. Now, the @app.route, this is referred to as a Python decorator, right? Or a function decorator is what you'll hear it referred to sometimes as. And what a decorator is think of it as the icing that's on top of the function cake. And what I mean by that is it's going to sit directly on top of the function that it's meant to work with. So the function here is called hello_world. And you can see that it highlights that, yep, that's a function. And when I mouse up over here, you can see the variable and the route. And so what is the route? And a lot of learners will think, oh, this is like an OSPF route or an EIGRP route. And no, remember, we're working with a web framework. So this is just basically saying the route to get to the root of the web server. Well, what is the root of the web server? Remember, when you go to a web page like www.cisco.com, that is the root of that web server. And then based on the Apache config or the IIS config, you're going to go to the index.html or whatever file it is they want you to go to. But this decorator works in conjunction with the function so that when we run, right, and this code here is commented out. I'm going to come to that in a second. So when we run, when we say app.run, and this is a Flask method that we're using with the Flask object app that we created here, when we run this file directly, Flask is going to run the little lightweight web server for us. And when I go to the root of the web page, in other words, for us, it's going to be localhost /5000, and 5000 is the default port, which is why I've got this little option down here to show us, well, what if we don't want it to be on the default port? What if I wanted to run this, all of these different little web apps I've got right here, all at the same time, but I want them to be all on different ports. And this is how we could achieve that. So all that's happening here with the if dunder name dunder main is this allows us to run this directly from the CLI as a Python module. And when we do, our Flask object is going to invoke the run method that runs our web server, so that when anybody who is hitting our app web server will route to, or when they route to the root of the web, that this is the function that's going to run, right? So really all this is, you can think of it as like the icing on the cake, but it's basically a pointer that says, oh, okay, you're hitting my little web app, so I'm going to route you, or when you route to the root of the web, I'm going to run this function. And that's all that's really happening. It's like a pointer that says, oh yeah, they hit the root of the web, so then run this function code for them. So let's see what this looks like. So I'm going to go out, I'm going to run this from the main page here, and you can see we have all of those files, app1.py here. So I'm just simply going to say python3 app1.py. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to start up Flask, and take a look, right? We've got serving Flask app1. And that's the name, right? That's the dunder name. This is the name of the app that you saw right here, right? Remember that? Remember this? If name is main, when we run it directly, well, the object, the Flask object that gets created is pulling the name from the file name. That's why we see that says app1 there, right? It says environment production, but warning, this is a development server. Do not use it. You would never use this in a production environment. This would be crazy. So the debugging mode is off, and then it tells you. So take a look here, running on, and that's the localhost address, or you can think of it as a loopback address, and port 5000. Now, let's go ahead and pull up our Chromium web browser, and let's go to localhost : 5000. Oops, sorry, put the colon in there. : 5000. And what are we going to see when we go here? Well, this is the, and I could even put the / in there, right? What do we see? We see hello world. Now, I've increased the size of everything in this window, so it's not going to come out like this by default on your virtual machine. And to increase the size on the Mac, it's just hold the control key down and hit plus. And you can see I'm 300% of the normal size. But that's just so we can see that when I go to the root of the web server, right, which is, we could put the / in there just like we see in the decorator, we get that text. So let's double check that. Is that what we expected to get? Absolutely. And it just returned hello world. And that's all that's happening in the code that you see for the lab. But before we step there, let's come back over here and take a look. All right, well, check this out. Flask is actually giving me output that shows, yeah, hey, there's GET requests coming in, right? And that's in a browser. A browser is just an HTTP client, right? That sends a GET request. Hey, give me the web page located here. And where is here for our Flask app? It's the root of the web server. And then we get our API, or I'm sorry, we get our HTTP status code of 200. So it does some logging as well. So how do we quit this? Well, I'm just going to say Control-C. Let's come back over here. And now let's comment this line out to see that, you know what, if you don't want to run it, on the default port of 5000, right? And this line here, you could actually put this in here. Now, you wouldn't, again, because that's the default, but that's what's actually happening right there, is it's just simply running on port 5000. So down here, we're going to start this and run it on port 5001. So I just saved it. Let's come back over here. Let me clear the screen. We'll kick off python3.app1, and right away we know, boom, it's running on port 5001. So pretty cool that you can actually change the port. So now that we've seen this simple example, let's take a look at the material from Lab 627 as to what's happening here. So there's a little bit more going on here, and you can see they've got some additional options down here. Now, what are we doing? We're from Flask, import Flask. We know we need the Flask class to create the sample Flask object, which is going to have the name when it kicks off as sample underscore app, because that's what this dunder name is going to give it. And then here we go. We have a decorator. It's the icing on top of the function cake. It's going to decorate our cake for us, because when they go to the root of the sample Flask web server, what is going to happen? Well, you can see the function's just def main, and it's going to return, you're calling me from the IP address. Now, this is a little different than the lab. I prefer to use the string format method here, but all we're doing is we're leveraging Flask to give us and so from Flask import request, right? So where's that request coming from? Well, we import it, right here. So I can simply say request dot remote address. And so give me the attribute that's the remote address. But it's the remote address. For us, though, it's going to be the local host, because that's how we're accessing everything here, right? But it's going to give me the address from which I'm hitting this web server. Now, we've got our if dunder name, dunder main, which means, hey, are you running it directly? And if that is true, which will be true in our case, then we run our sample Flask web object using the run method that's part of the Flask class. And what does this mean down here, right? Now, we know what the port means, so that means it's going to run on port 8080. Okay, cool. But what about this host equal quad zeros? Now, this is not, you could think of it as, I guess you could think of it as the default route, but all that is saying is I am spinning Flask up, and I'm going to run Flask on every single interface that this system has, right? So it's basically binding the Flask process to all interfaces. And that's what that quad zero means. Now, you could leave this in here. It's not going to cause any issues, and we're going to need this when we create our app. And so that's really all it means. Now, do you need to have it if you're just testing things locally on your system? Well, no. I just showed you, you don't have to say that. But this is going to bind this Flask process to all of the interfaces. All right, well, let's go ahead and let's run this code and see what happens. So, we're going to come to the command line here, and we're going to do a Control-C here. And what do we got? Sample app. So we'll say Python 3 sample app.py. And there we go. And you can see it gives you the little quad zeros, and then that's the port that we're running on. So let's check. Is this even working? Is this going to tell me? And remember, it's the root of the server. Now watch what happens if I say 8080 / and I say something like app. Like I think it's going to be under app v1, like maybe the path to an API, and we get request not found. Well, what does the lab, or what does the log show? Well, there you go. We get an HTTP 404 error, right? We did a get, we tried to go to app v1, and the web server log is telling me, yeah, no, resource not found. Okay, well, let's sort this out. We take a look at our code, and I figure, oh, yeah, right. I'm supposed to go to the root of 8080 and take a look at that. You are calling me from the IP address 127.0.0.1. And so that is all this Flask web app is doing. It just simply, you go, as soon as you hit the root, it's going to tell you, hey, you're coming from this address. All right, so now we're building on our knowledge of how Flask is working, and it's super straightforward and super simple. Let's take a look at another example here. Now, this one is, again, just from Flask, import Flask, and this is showing you, and I wanted to demonstrate that you can't, or you don't have to do just one sort of web path or web route. We can do multiple. So here, if they hit the root of the web page, in other words, they go localhost :5002, they're going to see welcome to my homepage. But what if they go to the /about? Well, the decorator here, that's the icing on top of the function cake, is going to go ahead and run this function. And that's all that the decorator is doing here, right? So for this app, this decorator knows that, hey, if they go to the root, we're going to do this. And then this app.route here says if they go to /about, then we're going to run this function, right? So think of the decorators as like a pointer to the function. Now, we've got the dunder name, dunder main down here, and it's just going to run on port 5002. So let's see. Could I have 2 pages being served up by Flask? And you absolutely can. We'll go ahead and save this, and we'll do a Control-C here, and we're going to call this app 2. I think we're on app 3, actually. All right, so there you go. And let me double check that. Oh, we're on app 2. Sorry about that. So let's go Control-C. Let's clear the screen here, and let's do app 2. So app 2 is going to be running on port 5002 on the local host. Let's come back over here, and let's see if I try to hit 8080, you can see site can't be reached because that is no longer running. What if I try to hit 5002? And I'll put the / in there, right? Because we're hitting the root of the web server. Welcome to my home page. All right, well, what is your home page about? I'll throw the / about in there. This is the about page. So this is how easy it is to spin up, again, a very lightweight, not a super feature-rich little web app that we can then use to our advantage here. Now, let's take a look at a little more complex example. And this one here just has 3 different things that you can go to. And take a look at what we're doing here. We're including the faker class, and we're going to have a page called random name. So every time you refresh random name, the page in the browser, it is going to generate a fake name for us, right? And we're going to run it on port 5003. So again, we're just kind of continuing to grow our Flask application here. So how do we do that? Well, let me go ahead and make sure that's been saved. We'll come over here. You can see we got the HTTP 200 code. It shows you, yeah, they hit the root. Somebody visited the root directory, and then somebody visited /about. So we do Control-C. And here we're going to say app3.py. Now, again, I could open tabs up here in the terminal, and I could literally start every single one of these files at the same time. We're not going to do that, but you could do that because they're all running on different ports. So this is going to be 5003. Oops, sorry. This is going to be 5003. So let's come back up here and let's see, what does it do when you go to the root of the website? And we don't want random name yet. All right, well, it says welcome to my homepage. Okay, cool. What happens if I go to 5003 / and I think there was an about? Yeah, so this is the about page. And then let's look at random name, right? And let's hit enter here. All right, so your fake name for today is Daniel Green. Now, when I hit refresh, take a look at what's happening there. So yeah, it's lightweight, but you could do some pretty cool stuff in here. So your fake name today is all of these different names. So every time I refresh, it's running. And take a look at my log. Yeah, they hit the root of your web server. They took a look at the about page. And now, boy, they're going bananas here with the random name page. And what is that random name page doing? Or what is the random name page doing here? Again, it's just generating these fake names. All right, so let's take it one step further, and this is our final step in this video, right? To show you that, yeah, we've been using all these other people's API, like MapQuest API server, or you might be using Google Maps API server, or we're using the student library API server. Well, what if you wanted to create a really lightweight Flask application? And all we're going to be doing here, and again, you could do get, post, put, patch, delete. You could do the whole 9 yards, but we're just going to set this up with get, right? Super simple example that you could then build off of. So from Flask, we're importing the Flask class, but we're also importing JSONify, and that's going to do exactly what it says, JSONify our response that we receive from, or that we provide. This is the server side here, right? And then we've got requests. And remember, this is not requests for HTTP. It's not that third-party module. This is a module that is, or a function that is part of Flask, of the Flask library of suites, right? Or the Flask module. So request is in there. So it's a little different than request for HTTP. So here's the code. You're totally familiar with this already. We spin up a Flask object from the class Flask. And here I even showed you for the route, right? So where do they have to hit the web server with their GET request? Well, I'm going to put in here /API/v1, just like we see when we use the MapQuest API. And so here is the icing on top of the function cake, meaning when they're going to API v1, issuing a GET request, which is the default, by the way, what are we going to do? Well, this is my API function. I'm going to say first under these variables, first underscore name, last underscore name, that whatever the GET request is that gets sent in with the first name and last name variables, I'm going to go ahead and I'm returning that information, right? Because take a look. Here's the response. We've got status is success. If this works, status would be success. The first name is going to be echoed out to them, and the second name is going to be echoed, or I shouldn't say echoed out. The first name and the last name, excuse me, are going to be basically given back to you, but we are going to give them to you in a JSONified format. And then we're running it on port 5004, right? That's how straightforward all of this is. Now, let's go ahead and run this. Let me save that, make sure we got everything saved there. But we're going to use the API client. And you guys have seen this before, right? Here's the import request. And so this is the requests HTTP library, the third-party library. Then we've got the built-in URL lib.parse because we're going to be doing the URL encode, right? Which is going to construct and take these parameters here. Now we're seeing a different way to use URL encode. Before, we use URL encode and we had variable names and values, and then we would kind of construct a little dictionary. Well, here is what I referenced earlier when we looked at Postman. And we looked at the code in Postman, and we saw that the payload and the headers of our GET request were empty. And then they kind of jammed it all right here in the URL. And it's like, yeah, that's one way to do it. But we can leverage the params dictionary here and pass in first name and last name. In fact, you could prompt the user when you run this for first name and last name, and then just instead of the first name and the last name is put the variable name in here that is capturing the input from the user. And then it would be dynamic. But this is a simple example just to show you that, yeah, we can say params and we're providing URL encode, a dictionary with key value pairs, right? That's all that's happening here, and that's our encoded params. And so we're going to get a string back from that because it's going to show everything encoded from our parameters, and then we create a URI variable. We use an F string here, right? Another way to see how you might do this. We take the base URL, which is our localhost 5004 API v1, and we put it right next to, we don't have to concatenate here because that's the beauty of this F string. And we take our encoded parameters. So we're going to get HTTP localhost 5004 API v1 / encoded params, which is going to be the question mark along with first name and last name and what those values are when we send in that GET request. And you can see I'm printing it out right here. So we're going to be able to see what the entire GET request URI is. And then we capture a requests object, right? And we capture it in the variable name response. So we say request.get. So I'm sending the GET request to my locally running Flask web app. And if my response status code, and take a look at this, maybe this is code you want to include in your MapQuest app, right? When you go to enhance things, check to see, hey, is the HTTP status code 200? If it is, I'm going to go ahead and say, hey, your HTTP status code was 200. And I'm going to use the format method with the string class here. And if it's not 200, I'm going to say, hey, your request failed with a status code of, and let's see if we can get a different status code other than 200 here by maybe not putting in, I can comment out the last name. But let's run this right now. Let's see what happens here. So again, I'm running the client. Let me start the server. We've got to start the API server. So I can kill this. We'll say clear. And let's go ahead and run our API server.py. We're going to fire it up. There it is. It's running on port 5004 on the local host. We're going to go to that loopback address. And again, I could have put quad zeros in here, but you don't need to, right? Because by default, it's going to run on the loopback address, localhost address. All right, so let's pull up the, oh wait, I got to go over here actually. Okay, and so from here, I can run that Python client script, the API client script, which is right here, which is going to send in my GET request. So let's see what happens when we do that. So we're going to say Python 3 and API client.py. All right, well, here it is. The entire GET request URI is, and take a look at that. When we encoded those parameters, URL encode knows we need that question mark in there. Remember, what is the question mark? All the question mark is the parameter separator here, right? So we've got the scheme, which is HTTP, or it could be HTTPS. Again, for us, it's going to be HTTP because we're not doing any SSL or anything like that. So the scheme is HTTP, the authority, in other words, the address that we're going to, and then the path on the API server, and then from the path, we separate the query parameters from the path with the question mark. And then there it is. First name, last name, Travis Monfili. So let me ask you this. What would happen if I took this and I copied this? Oops, and we'll say copy link. I'll just come down to copy. If I copy that and I pull Postman up, what happens if I dump that here into Postman and click send? Yeah, it runs. Status success, code is 200, 12 milliseconds. So again, it's just a GET request. So we've actually created our own API server using Flask. And this is how, this is how easy it was to do that. And now you can take a look at this and say, oh, well, if I have API route, or if I have the app route decorator and I go API v1, I could handle a post request, a put request, a delete, and you can add the functionality on as you see fit. So let's make a change here. Let's go ahead and we are going to do this. We're going to comment out last name because I'm curious to see if we can get a different response code, right? Let's see if we can break this. So let's run it again. And we get first name. So, okay, so it looks like I don't have the code on the API server actually to handle, well, what would happen if both of those arguments aren't passed in, right? Or both of those values don't exist, first name and last name. So it looks like it's just going to give you the first name. But again, a very simple example of how you could create your own little API server, and you could test making GET requests, RESTful GET requests to that API server. All right, well, that is going to do it for, we'll call it a deep dive here on the Flask Web Application Framework. Again, the key being is having an understanding of what that code is actually doing in Lab 627 Part 3. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.